Hey everybody, this is Brian Yellow. Number 38 of Origin Stories on Creativity. I had the pleasure of speaking with Varla Ventura. She is a author of paranormal books, collections, stories on the occult, paranormal events, ghost stories, vampires, fairies. We had a very nice conversation. She not only talked about her passions, she also ventured into the professional side of her career, what it's like being a traditionally published author, the perils, the joys, the working within a team, an editorial staff, a publishing staff. I had a lot of fun. And, the notes on the episode will definitely be filled with a treasure trove of enjoyable topics. Check out her website. It's definitely worth a gander, and also her books are very well put together. She is a magnificent author, and with no further ado, I will let her go ahead and fill your ears with magnificent wonder.
I would say anything that has to do with hauntings, ghost stories, or sort of freaky kind of facts and weird news. I mean, that's always been one of my favorite topics. So I could probably go on and on, but luckily I have a good editor who stops me before everyone gets too sick of me.
Yeah, that helps, doesn't it? I don't have one of those. My volumes can get kind of big. Did it start with poetry for you? I mean, when did it start? As a child? Did it start with W.B. Yeats, or how did it start for you exactly?
Well, I was my I was reading at a pretty young age, and my mom had a lot of interesting books on the bookshelf. She's not maybe your average mom. She had a lot of, well, she was from San Francisco, so maybe she's an average San
Oh,
Francisco mom. She had a lot of occult books, references to lucid dreaming,
oh, that stuff is
seances,
so cool.
ghost
Can you lucid
stories.
dream? Did you ever get
Yeah,
into that?
yeah, actually, I have a kind of an interesting lucid dreaming story, and I credit my mom. It was the first time I ever lucid dreamt was I was a child and I was having a nightmare, and she actually taught me how to control my dreams by basically just giving me the tools to solve my nightmare. And she didn't call it lucid dreaming.
Well,
She just said, "This is what you do. You fall back asleep, but this time, when you fall into that ditch, you're going to imagine our Great Dane is going to come and pull and throw down a rope and pull you out." And I went back to sleep, and I had that exact scenario played out where I was able to kind of like I fell as I had, which was my part of the nightmare, and yet I called in the help and took control. And so I knew that I was dreaming. I still remember that dream very well. So my mom was very open to the psychic arts and the world of the occult. And we spent time, and we always, anywhere we'd ever go, we went to cemeteries. We used to eat our lunch in a cemetery. I mean, we just spent a
wow.
lot of time. And so these things were not really frightening to me.
And she already took
Halloween,
away your nightmares, didn't she? She took away those things that gave you terror in the middle of the night that left you screaming as a child. She
right?
gave
I
you
mean, that's a lot
something
scarier
to,
than a ghost, right?
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, alone in bed, you got to be able to control that stuff. That's neat.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm still able to do it for the most part. I certainly have a lot of that sleep paralysis that occurs pretty frequently, and a few moments of that, like not quite able to wake up. And I'm not always completely in control in my dreams, but I am able to sort of like sway things and be conscious in my dreams
Hmm.
for the most part each night. So, and that's something that people can spend a lifetime studying, and I'm sure I could get better at it, but
Hmm.
luckily for me, it's like a foreign language. When you learn it when you're that young, just as you learn that to accept the paranormal realm when you're that young, you don't really question it in the same way. Now, you can be an adult and take, French but if you learned French when you were 4 years old because your mother spoke it, you are going to have a natural ability and a natural fluency in it that you wouldn't
Yeah.
have otherwise. So I kind of look at it in that it was the language I was exposed to as a young child.
Was your mother had no doubts? Like she believed wholeheartedly in the occult, though. There were ghosts, there were spirits, there was fairies, there was that
Oh
whole.
yeah, yeah. Well, she has a lot of questions. Still has a lot of questions, and is sort of has an ever evolving perspective, which I really appreciate because sometimes I can get in a sort of a narrow niche, or believe it or not, I can actually get really skeptical because I am exposed to so many people in this community that I, you know, don't believe.
Because you speak that
So
language. You speak the language and they can understand that they have a common ground with you.
yeah, and but sometimes people tell me things that I don't believe them. And I that's something that I have to work through both as a writer and as a listener and a collector of stories, but also because of the kind of work that I do need to be discerning. And so sometimes I'll find myself getting kind of skeptical, and my mom will give me sort of a more open perspective on that, and we can talk about things of that nature. We talk about things of the occult and metaphysics, and the evolution of fairies and writing, and we can have conversations about that. Now I can't always tell her about minute details of my life, but I can talk to her about these grand things, so I count myself lucky.
Yeah.
Certainly. But yes, just to answer your question, she, I would say that there was never any doubt that these things were real. And so in that way, just as you might have been raised in an environment to believe in God or to believe in, a certain facet of Christianity, I, I was raised, well, not quite the opposite. I wouldn't say it's not exclusive of it, but this was sort of, the closest thing we had to religion in our households.
I'm a creative writer. I look for an excuse to believe anything.
I know, right? I always say I'm a supernaturalist. I'll go
I
for
like
just
the
about
flat
it.
Earth guys. I'm like, how can that work? Let's find an
Yeah,
excuse to make that real today. I love
absolutely.
everything.
Absolutely. And I think you do have to have a certain, I mean, what you put on page, you have to be discerning about. But in terms of hearing
Let's make
stories
it
and
real.
absorbing things, you do have to have this open mind, because otherwise, if you start putting blocks up about, what's real and what's not, and who's lying, if you start putting blocks up initially, you won't be able to break through to that like bigger creative expanse, which you need just in order to be able to write or gain a new perspective on something.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I mean, so as a young child, you are exploring how to break through your dreams, how to control those. You have a mother who's helping you through this really murky landfill of the occult. That's a wonderful world that I didn't really get to explore very much, so I don't really know it. Um, and now you've got this world where you're exploring what as a teenager? Are you?
Drugs, no. Let's be honest.
Well, okay, you get to explore a lot with drugs. I didn't get that
Well,
when I was a teenager. I was a straight-laced dude, unfortunately.
oh well, I
You
think
would
you
have got along with my
probably
brother.
did.
He was that.
Yeah. There's one in every family. No, I mean I say that somewhat jokingly. I mean, I definitely transitioned from like kind of the general. I mean, I wouldn't say that I really had a full understanding of the occult at the age of 9 or anything like that,
No, no, no. Of course not.
but I did know the basics of tarot and astrology by that age, certainly. For me, I went the Lovecraftian path, I guess, or
Oh
somewhat,
yeah.
the Mary Shelley path. I went into horror, reading a lot of horror, a lot of scary stories, old and new, a lot of those like classic ghost stories. I mean, I still have like probably one of my favorite books as a teen was the it was like the Penguin Compendium of Victorian Ghost Stories.
Oh
And
yeah,
that
I've
thing,
read that. I've
the
read those stuff.
cover is basically dust now, and it was a soft cover book, but it is just shredded. But I still have the same one. The glue of the binding is brittle, but I've read that thing to death, and yet I will go and read it again, because every time, I was just telling someone the other night, I think I've read Bram Stoker's Dracula 4 or 5 times in my life, and yet there's certain things about it I never retain. And so when I go back to read it, perhaps this is a result of the teen experimentation, but when I go back in to read it, I find something new in it every time. And it's one of those books, I think everyone has those books in their life that they repeat, because it's almost like a landmark of where you are in your life and where your
Yeah.
mind has gone, and it can remind you of how you thought of something, but you see things with a new perspective. And for me, Dracula and Frankenstein are great examples of that. I keep reading them. Now I read them more as a writer, which is a totally different thing than reading them as a reader, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah,
And
totally.
and that's a deeper, another level of reading that, it's not always as pleasurable, I'll be honest. It's nice to just get lost in the story, but sometimes when you stop and start thinking about technique and how they actually finished the story, because that's always, I could start a million stories, I could start a million books, but to finish them, if I don't have a deadline and someone breathing down my neck and hanging a check over my head, I sometimes can't always finish. And so, of course, like many writers, there are a lot of projects that I have yet to get to,
I
because
wish I was having a check dangled in front of my face. That would be nice.
well,
Unfortunately, I've got a
don't get me
novel right
wrong,
now
you
that
kind of
just
pay it back.
lingering.
Yeah.
What's
Well,
that?
I said it's all in advance against royalties. So until you start selling enough of your book, it's basically like you just borrowed a little money from the publisher
Yeah,
to tide
that's
you
odd
over.
though, right? That's stress.
Yeah.
Do you wish you had stayed in indie publishing, or had you ever been an indie writer, or had you always gone the traditional route?
I mean, I did a little, early weird poetry and things like that. But my publisher, I think, is considered an indie publisher. Certainly, the Wiser Books imprint of my publisher is, a pretty small book publisher in the grand scheme of things. But they are a traditional book publisher,
Mhm.
which I really like. I mean, I do spend time sometimes working on other people's projects as an editor, and I like the bookmaking process. And I'm sure at some point I will have a book that everyone will say no to. And then when that happens, I will, consider the self-publishing route. But luckily for me, the first book I wrote for them was successful enough that it, moved forward from there. And, the first book was kind of something they wanted. And then the second book was something I wanted. And then the third book was something I wanted. And then we both wanted the rest. So I have a really good publishing relationship with them. So, as long as that lasts, I'm going to cling to that for
No,
sure.
no, totally. I mean, obviously you're in a good place and you had good ideas. I'm looking at the market right now in terms of traditional versus indie. I mean, the indie
Yeah.
market is saturated, isn't it? I mean, in terms of how do you get ahead? How do you float to the top? The cream
Yeah,
doesn't
that's your
necessarily rise in this market anymore, does it?
well, there's two things though about indie publishing, like and like publishing yourself, self-publishing. It doesn't have the stigma that it once had, 10 or 15 years ago, where you basically, it was because no one, even though I just said this, but it's not, people don't choose that line of publishing only and exclusively because a larger publisher won't publish them. They often choose it because they have complete creative control. They do usually have to put some money in it up front, but there are ways that you can minimize those costs. And then you have control over the cover. You have control over what stores it goes into. Now, if you're not a good salesperson, though, and you actually want to make money, you're never going to get your book in Walmart as an indie publisher. If someone has, by all means, correct me. But if you, and I'm not saying Walmart's your life goal, but they're going to order 5,000 copies at once
Well, I
versus,
mean, in terms of not being a good salesperson, absolutely you're not getting your book in Walmart. But
yeah,
coupled with being a fantastic salesperson, yeah, you're probably going to get your book in Walmart. But are you going to be writing great books? I don't know.
yeah. I
You know
mean,
what I don't know if they
in
go
my
hand in hand.
experience, most writers, it's a very, very, very rare combination of a writer that can really sell themselves. There are plenty of writers who are good at promoting themselves within a certain template. There are plenty of writers who are wonderful speakers and wonderful at kind of putting themselves out there and going to book signings and being proactive. But being able to book all those things yourself, being able to, write the press release, like just to know that structure, that's where a publisher comes in. Of course, you can hire people, but in my experience, most people who are writers are creative types, and creative types need some left brain people to kind of help them with the structure so that you can have a very dynamic indie publishing team. But to do it yourself, I mean, it's got extra challenges on top of the fact that you still have to keep writing. So
Just as an excuse to talk about myself, this whole
yeah.
podcast process, this project, I mean, it's been wonderful to talk to other authors, to break out of my troll cave and to interact with other artists. But at the same time, I'm barely able to put 2 or 3 short stories together in a month. You know what I mean? I mean, I've
Oh
put
yeah. Oh,
38
short stories are so
podcasts.
hard.
Well,
Just
yeah,
because
they
they're
are.
short. I mean, they're harder than a novel, because the novel you can just kind of keep going and keep going until you said it all. The short story is like, the art of the short story is probably one of the highest art forms in terms of creative writing, I think, because you got to get there, and you got to get there,
Yeah.
in a certain number of words, and that's not always that easy to do.
But it's hard to do all the other stuff too, coupled with, another project. I mean,
I
it's
don't
like
like
by
doing all
yourself.
the other stuff. Just like
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean, I
exactly.
do a
I
lot of
want to
that
write. I
stuff.
want to do the creative stuff. I want to glue the pictures together. I don't want to do the marketing. I don't want to do the
Yeah,
sales stuff. I don't want to do that.
no,
I have a
no.
friend who likes the sales, the business part of it.
Yes.
She does the
You
writing
want
and
the
stuff too,
marketing
but
person to tell you what to do, and then you do the creative part of that. And they say,
mhm,
follow this A to Z.
yeah.
And for me, that's just works a lot better because, it's just a lot easier for a writer to be able to do that. I mean, it's probably a bit of a luxury, and I'm certainly not rolling in money, and I'm still scrambling on to make ends meet sometimes, and I'm still not selling as many copies as I'd like. But if maybe I had like a publisher like Penguin, perhaps I would sell more, but I wouldn't have the relationship that I have. And so I feel very loyal to my publisher in that way. They are like a parent to me. And
Yeah.
so I will be loyal to them until, we both agree that we should go in a different direction. So far, that hasn't happened. Also, I really like the covers that they do. I mean, that to me is it was such a huge risk with the first book of the Bazaar, of just feeling like, okay, so I'm a lover of strange things. I love all those, strange tales, weird tales, the Ripley's Believe It or Not. I loved those books. I loved them growing
Oh,
up.
you're right though. This is a great cover.
And when they sent me the cover, I loved, but when they showed me the interior, which has clip art with like funny little bone skeleton
Yeah,
guys,
I love
and
it. I love the art.
there's just
That's
like this
really
kind of
good.
Victorian sensibility, and I just thought, oh my God, this is like better than I could have imagined it. This makes the words stand out. This enhances the writing. And so I'm very fortunate that they got the aesthetic immediately. And so the aesthetic of the books continued in a way that it just doesn't always happen that way, and a lot of writers are disappointed. And I'm sure there's many writers,
Yeah.
that
Well, I talked to a writer who went and published her first book, and she had to work really, really hard to try to get them to do a cover that made sense to the story that she was trying to tell. And I
yes,
don't think she
that's
ever
a
really
huge
came up with
challenge.
something. And
Oh no,
she's
I've worked with writers as an editor that they have called me in tears because of the title had been changed and the cover had been changed, and they're just in tears because
Yeah.
most of the time you actually do not get cover consultation rights. You don't. It's like a standard that you don't. Now, some writers have the pull to do it. I might try in my next contract. I hope they're not listening. But, I also know that if I were to call them crying, they would probably do something.
But how much, I mean, what could you do? I mean, is it in the novel? I mean, is it in the
Cry.
book?
You can
I mean,
cry.
is there a communication problem? Is there a hiring problem? I mean, where does the problem lie? I mean,
The problem, so I think the problem lies within the connection between the writer's vision and the publisher's ability to sell it in a certain market. So the writer always sees their work in a certain way. The
obviously.
publisher sees it in a different way. They see
Hmm.
it as part of a category. They see it as part of something. And no matter how thoughtful and deep and intimate of a relationship you have with them, they are still trying to make your book be the next, Eat, Pray,
Yeah.
Love, or whatever it is.
Whatever
And
they're hoping for.
so sometimes you can get a cover designer who maybe doesn't get it, or the editor doesn't get it. As much as an editor can save you, editors sometimes aren't conveying the right thing, or the publisher just puts their foot down and says, no, I want a blue cover. We've got, we're doing blue covers this year. I mean, honestly, like, you've heard crazy stories of
Yeah.
William Randolph Hearst and as this like eccentric publisher. I mean, it exists. I've experienced it. I've experienced publishers who will say things that seem arbitrary, but it's up to them. So we want, only this kind of, font on the spine, and just things like that. So there's so many little things along there, but I think it's a little easier if you are nonfiction to kind of get your message a little clearer with, okay, I'm writing a book about angels, for example, which I would never do, but I'm just saying, here's what
Wouldn't angels kind of fall into your kind of thing, though? I mean, that's kind of, I mean, granted it's religious, but I mean,
I think
doesn't that
I'd
fall
be
into the
more
occult in a way?
inclined to write about demons than angels.
Demons.
I could,
Okay.
at the risk of putting myself in a darker category, which is the category I prefer.
Well, some angels
Yeah.
are dark, though. Demons are kind of the
And
minions of
demons
dark.
are light, right? I mean,
The devil is just a
I
fallen
love them all. No.
angel.
But I'm just, okay, let's say I'm writing a book that says, like, I'm, communicate, the communication with angels or something like that.
Hmm.
Now, if I were to say, oh, better example, I'm writing a book about demons, and I call them up and I say, please, please do not put, this old painting, this old Greek painting that depicts like so and so slaying a demon. Like, whatever you do, that's a public domain art. Please don't put that on the cover. They would probably say, okay, all right. But that's because I've sold books already. If you just come in and you're like, I don't like X, Y, Z, and I also don't like D, E, and F. I mean, they're going to say, we reserve the right to make this book the best success. And you know what? The truth is, sometimes writers are wrong. You have a vision of what your book is like, and it's actually not like that to everyone else.
That was
So,
the thought that I was having, actually. As a writer, I go into a room with whatever the team is going to be, the publisher, the marketer, the illustrator, the editor. It's no longer just me in my troll cave writing a book. Now I'm part of a team. I'm part of a process that's going to make people money. I've got that person who's trying to pay their mortgage and their car payment and put their kid through private school. I am now part of that I'm a cog, and I need to
right.
be, a part of that. I need to get on board. I want to put my signature on that contract.
Well,
And
and
if
it
they
can
all
be,
have a vision, then I need to either put my voice inside that vision and fight hard for what I think, or I need to back up and, not sign that contract and
and
find
exactly, fight hard for what you think before you sign the contract, because once you sign the contract,
I lose my
you can
ability to be a
fight
little
all you
baby,
want,
right?
but it just
Yeah.
might not actually, it could fall on deaf ears. So,
If I want to have complete control, then it's going to be a lot harder to write that second novel or book or whatever it's going to be. and I'm probably going to lose reputation, right? I mean,
Well, okay, so that's something that's not quite as true anymore. I don't think in the world of publishing, I don't think it's quite as true that you will lose face by having an independently published or self-published book. However, there's another aspect to that, and that is that, you know, if you have a self-published book and you get a pretty decent number of books sold with like next to no marketing and next to no you know, connections, a larger publisher might actually consider that as an asset and say, hey, this has sold 550 copies with, you know, well, they probably want more than that, but okay, this has sold 1,000 copies since it came out 6-7 months ago, and you know, it's independently published. They've done no marketing, they've done no outreach. It's still basically a new book. We could swoop in, put a fancier cover on it, get it to all of our distributors, and you know, a lot of the work is already done there, right? It's been mostly edited. There might be some small things to make it fit a certain style or whatever, but so it's not always a bad thing. I mean, if you're on the fence considering that, I guess my question to you would be, how hard have you tried to get it conventionally published? And if you feel like you just want to get it published to get it done and get it out there, then, you know, I mean, it is a lot of work to be sending these proposals around, and, you know, not everybody can just say, hey, I have a new book coming out, and have the publisher go, great, what is it? We'll put it on the list. You know, that's pretty rare. But like Stephen King can probably do that. Like, I'm sure he contracts for multiple books at a time, and then, you know, it's just like, whatever he comes up with is fine by us. Just tell us, you know, a year in advance so we can start selling it.
Just Stephen King's name on top of a book. It's like, what? I just did a podcast on him yesterday, honestly.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. Where I'm trying to put another project together called Mirage, speculating on speculative fiction.
Oh,
It's kind
funny.
of
I like
I've
that.
done 2 episodes. It's a nice little thing. I like it. So this one's Origin, where I'm talking to authors and, you know, content creation. That one I'm actually talking about authors who have already established themselves in their careers, and he's made $400 million. Basically, he write his own check. He made $1 million for every single book he's published. There's my dog barking at another dog.
We call it a werewolf. This is a werewolf in the background.
What do you, I mean, right now, when I published my book, I didn't publish it. Actually, when I finished my book, I contacted agents. That was the first thing I did, was send query letters to every single agent that I could find. Number one, I didn't know what genre I wrote. I thought I called it crime, noir, urban, thriller type situation. It was more literary, but I didn't know how to sell a literary novel. I didn't know exactly what I had. You know what I mean? I'm writing alone in my troll basement. I finished a novel. What do you do with it?
Yeah.
Everybody's saying, you know, find an agent. No agent wants me. I've got like, you know, 100 followers on Twitter. My family knows me, and that's basically about it.
Well, I mean, you can find an agent. You're not going to find like the fanciest literary agent in New York, but it is kind of a funny thing, because you get in that position of like, well, in order to even get an agent, I have to have a following, but in order to get a following, I have to have something for people to follow.
Yeah.
So, you know, you get in this kind of, well, just this rut of just feeling like I need an agent to represent me, to sell me to these publishers, but I can't get an agent because they're, you know, they won't even read what I have.
They don't even read my query letter most times.
I mean, and sometimes though, you know, the thing to do is just go past the agent and write the query letter to the publisher themselves. Just get, you know, go on the website, find the, you know, it's usually like editor at whatever their thing is, or intern at, get the address, send a, you know, an email submission if they accept it, read the submission guidelines, and just submit it directly. You know, I'm pretty sure that J.K. Rowling did not have an agent. She just,
and that's what I hear, right? I mean, she sold right to publishers, and you think,
if
wow,
I remember
that's
right, the story I heard, which could be just like totally anecdotal, but I thought, and I heard this, of course, from like a younger editorial assistant at my publisher. She said, did you know that it wasn't actually the managing editor who selected that. It was actually like an editorial assistant or an assistant. And the thing is the assistants, you know, people think, oh, well, they're not the deciders, but they're going through that slush pile. They're going through the, you
Yeah,
know,
I heard that too.
inbox. And so if you can attract their attention and they read it, then they put it on the desk of the next person and the next person. And it really does still work that way unless you're working directly with a very small publisher where the publisher actually acquires books directly and will go through that slush pile or will, you know, sift through things themselves. So, but I mean, that's, you know, if you can't get an agent to represent you, trust me, if you sell your book, agents will come after you.
No, it's very true. And honestly, the idea of being,
And then you don't need them.
yeah, I know, right? Do you, well, I won't ask you any personal questions like that.
I do not have an agent. No,
Do you
I do not have
recommend
an
that
agent.
somebody have an agent? Do you think that we need protection in this world, or do you think that publishers aren't as nefarious as, I don't know, are they even displayed as nefarious?
Oh no, I'm totally on the side of the traditional publisher, and I think you just need a friend who has had a book contract before and can help you sift through the legal language. I think that's what you really need, and that's what an agent is. It's your friend, kind of selling your
Kind of.
book.
Who wants 20% of what you make?
Now, I will say, I mean, agents do, you know, they will get things seen. It's just like a PR person. They're just like, they'll keep following up. They'll keep sending emails. So there's nothing wrong with having an agent. But if you're finding that agents are rejecting you, you might want to just
Skip the whole thing, huh?
skip that process. I mean, it's what's going to happen. You're going to get a rejection letter directly from the publisher, at least. You
Something.
know,
I mean, I'm already
now
experiencing.
you have a name. Now you can
Why
follow the
not?
name.
Actually, I think I sent a query letter to every single agent out there, so I might as well just go ahead and skip that process.
You might as well. Yeah.
Actually, I have a friend. You know, he's been on the podcast twice. He recommends, you know, if you want to sell your first novel, write your second novel. If you want to sell your second novel, write a third novel. And that's basically what I'm doing, is just, you know, building, you know, a base and writing. I'm a writer.
Yeah,
I'm not
exactly.
a seller. I'm a writer. So that's what I'm doing, is writing.
It's hard to not get caught up in the, you know, you've completed something and you want to sell that and you get caught up in that, and that detracts from the creative process. And like that second novel is probably going to be better than the first one. The
And I'm
second book is
embarrassed by
always
this first
better.
one now. Honestly, I look back on it and I'm like, oh man, I wish I had now had another opportunity to write it. You know, do another rewrite, because I want to add some more fantasy elements to it. It's not a thriller now. I'm a fantasy speculative author. Where's the fantasy elements? It's not published.
Right.
They'll do that. You know what I mean? That's great, kind of,
Right.
in a
But
way.
yeah, I mean, you can always revise it, but once you kind of sell it as a certain thing, it's definitely, you know,
It's
um,
done.
you're not going to want to be sending it. Well, there's something a little different with the process, and you know, I don't have a lot of fiction publishing experience. My work is considered folklore and nonfiction technically, and the nonfiction process is quite different from the fiction process in terms of approaching publishers, because usually when you have something fiction you're selling, you have to have it pretty much complete.
Yeah,
If they ask for the rest of the manuscript, you need to have
you
it so
gotta
you
have
can
it.
finish the novel. With nonfiction publishing, you can sell on an idea and a very fleshed out proposal and like a
What's that
sample
look like?
chapter or two.
A su-
Okay, I can tell you exactly what an ideal proposal has, regardless of what your genre is.
Mhm.
An ideal proposal has a very polite and concise cover letter with all of your contact info and a brief summary of what your project is. It has a table of contents if you're doing something that has a table of contents, like a
Mhm.
collection of stories or a nonfiction work, or just sort of like an outline. It has an excerpt from the introduction. It has at least 1 to 2 sample chapters completely done, your best sample chapters. And then it has an analysis of works that are popular in your genre that are similar to yours and why yours is different. And that is the thing that people need an agent for.
And that's how you sold your first book, or did you already have that written at that time?
Yeah, it was on an idea.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's
it was on an
neat.
idea.
So
And
they bought it and you just wrote it based on the idea that I'm a published author, and that's how you went to coffee shops buying your lattes. Like,
so what
I'm
you
a
want to
published
do
author.
is you want to go and say, having other people buy you lattes, that's ideal. Because anyone who's a published author will tell you you cannot afford lattes every day. But you know, the thing that you can do is you can think like, what, it's hard for writers to do this sometimes because they don't want to compare themselves to other people, and
Mhm.
so they leave this part out. But I guarantee you, if your cover letter says this is like Eat Pray Love meets War of the Worlds,
Mhm.
they're gonna say, oh, I know what that means. Eat Pray Love is this like divorcees adventures. War of the World is this like, you know, science fiction
Invasion.
like
Yeah.
invasion. Oh my god, what, how can these two things possibly come together? So you want to compare, but then also you don't want to compare it to, even though I just said two of the most popular things I could think of, you don't always want to compare it to the most popular works, because everybody's going to go around saying, oh, well, this is basically just like Gone Girl. You know, this novel is
Yeah.
just
But
like
that's the
Gone Girl.
trope, isn't it? It's the
Yeah.
producers in Hollywood doing that in their suit and tie.
And they can do that. They can do that because they can say that, and they can say this is the next Gone Girl. You want to say, you know, something a little more unique than that, but you do want to look at, and it's
This
very
is the
difficult.
woman who gets divorced, who has a you know, whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, or you can just say, you know, you can use a classic example, or you can just say, it's difficult for writers to do that because we all have egos and we don't like to be told that we write like someone else or we
Yeah,
are like someone
we're
else.
unique. We're unique butterflies.
Yeah, but the truth is, you know, there are people in your category that sell well, and for you to be able to say, you know, just like in Gone Girl, this is a thriller in which the story is told backwards, and you're left breathless, wondering who is actually missing and who's at fault. Just like that, my story will take the readers on this, you know, psychological journey, but my twist is, you know, XYZ, you know, it's from a man's perspective, or, you know, the heroine is a hairy monster, whatever your kind of unique twist is. So you're
Yeah,
doing a comparison, and you're not saying that yours is better, but you're saying it's as good, but yet it's different and possibly better. So that's very difficult for writers to do. It's
very.
very difficult. I had a hard time doing it with this next book that I sent in. I thought, I've read so many, and this is what you always think as a writer. I've read so many books like this, but there's really nothing like this out there. Every
They
writer
call it
thinks
they call it an elevator spiel, don't they? When you get on an
yes,
elevator and you try to
elevator pitch.
tell the guy what your book is about between the floors, and
Yeah.
I can't do it.
Yeah. So
You know what I
what's
mean? If I
your
got on an
elevator?
elevator, I don't have one. I would need 60,000 words, and that's exactly the number that it took me to write the novel in the first place. Here, let me tell you my whole story. That's what I would need. I don't
Yeah.
have the ability
Well,
to do that. I
let me
cannot
start
sum
at the beginning. And so maybe you do need an agent.
it up. So there's this guy.
He's like about my age and
He's sitting on
my
his
height.
bed, okay, and he's crying.
And you don't know why.
His living room is really messy. Oh, you getting off here? No, wait.
Wait. Let's
No,
just
no,
hit
I'm not
this
done.
red button right
Come
here.
back.
This is the
Okay,
red.
I'm going to follow you. This is where you work. This is your office. Can I sit here for a minute? I don't know.
Well, I mean, the other thing that can help is, you know, you can say, well, I have, you know, 3,000 YouTube followers, so they'll probably buy my book right off the bat, you know, things like that.
Exactly.
So you're building another kind of network and that can totally work. But it is very challenging. I mean, like
Yeah.
even for me, writing this next book for me is, it won't be out until next year, but it's probably my favorite book that I've written because I actually really, really enjoyed reading back through it.
Yeah.
just because the topic was just so dear to my heart. It's a collection of firsthand people told me their first or prominent paranormal experiences that they've had in their
I
life.
love stuff like that.
There's
I don't
haunted
know what I
places.
believe or whatever, but I've never had a paranormal experience myself. I've never seen a ghost. I've been scared, obviously, but I've never seen a ghost, but I love listening to ghost stories.
Well, it's never too late.
That's
It can
true.
still
I don't
happen
know if I
to
want to
you.
have a ghost experience though, or a paranormal experience, or like wake up and see a vampire looming over me. But
Well, I'll tell you, seeing a ghost is one thing that the idea of seeing a ghost, and this is the entire horror fiction genre, is built on the idea of seeing a ghost or seeing a supernatural creature or having this encounter is more terrifying than most of the time when and I've had a number of paranormal experiences, and it's such a surreal thing that's happening in the real time that your mind kind of goes very matter of fact about it. And so, those scenarios where the person doesn't run right away in the horror movie and they're just kind
yeah,
of staring, like
they're trying to
that
make sense of it,
actually,
right? This
yeah,
isn't like
that is actually like that delay. So you kind of go into like, maybe you're just going into like survivor adapter mode. But for me, it's just like, huh. And then your mind starts going, did that actually happen? And you have to write it down and you have to start thinking about it. And then if it happens again, you can kind of start, realizing what's happening. But yeah, and then I also talk about haunted places and the history of sort of the rise of Victorian spiritualism and
Victoria spiritualism.
Victor.
Is that like tarot cards and like
It's parlor games.
crystal balls?
Yeah, so basically the spiritualist movement came about in like the late Victorian era and went up and through the, 20s and 30s really. And it was the rise of the belief in the afterlife as sort of a spiritual
Oh,
practice. And that is
it's
when
Houdini, right? His
yeah,
wife was big into it.
Houdini was a big, yes. And there were many kind of like famous mediums, but just getting back to the topic of this interview and the origin of creativity, were a number of women, and one in particular who they channeled material. And so for Victorian women, you can
What do you
imagine.
mean channeled material?
So they wrote through the Ouija board or through a spirit board. And there was one woman who would go into trance, and she published several poems, several collections of poetry under the name Patience Worth. And this was a channeled entity who was writing. And because she actually was a very good writer, and this channeled material won like national poetry awards and things like that.
That's interesting.
It's really crazy. And so you think there was also a woman who channeled the lost novel. She called it the lost novel of Mark Twain, and said that the ghost of Samuel Clemens
That's so
came
cool.
to her through a medium, and they painstakingly dictated a novel through the Ouija board, word by word, 60,000 word novel, that the ghost of Mark Twain was channeling to them. And she and her husband and the medium all took dictation and then claimed it was his novel. And it was actually pulled from the shelves thanks to a lawsuit by his publisher and Samuel Clemens' daughter.
Oh, that's disappointing.
Now you can find it though. You can find the thing in its entirety on Gutenberg, which is an online
royalty-free place.
Yes.
Has anybody done any studies on that novel? Has anybody looked at it and done any like language comparison?
I have. I mean, I have, and I can tell you there's no way that was Mark Twain.
Oh, okay.
However, I do think that she was very good at. Now if she had picked a more obscure author, she might not have had so much success. But this author, I mean, it did make people go, huh, maybe, because his voice is, you could replicate it, like, I mean, you're never going to nail it completely, but it's not very good. So it nails his voice, and it sounds a lot like something he would write, but the writing, I mean, you're bored halfway in it. And Twain doesn't really do that. I mean, he's not my favorite author, but you do get lost in his words and you kind of follow him with the story. This, I could barely muddle my way through it. So I knew it wasn't him based on that. But I think what I love about it is the sort of story that it tells within that story, and that is of these, women in particular in
That
the
was my
Victorian
thought just
era.
now too. The idea, the story of them writing the story is fascinating.
Yes, and that they didn't have, I mean, Victorian women didn't have a lot of options. Let's be honest. They could be, they could marry well, they could become a teacher, they could join a nunnery, they could live a life of servitude. I mean, there were not very many occupations, and to be a
Sadly,
successful writer, or journalist, you really had to have connections or be really bootstrappy. And so the woman who did this channeling of Mark Twain's novel was actually her name was Emily Grant Hutchings, and she was a journalist. And there was actually evidence, there is evidence, and I'd love to like do a greater kind of thesis on this, and maybe someone else has, but there's actually evidence of letters between her and Twain in which he kind of says to her, well, just keep writing. Like, I can't give you any more advice. And she was a little bit like a needy fangirl. So there's a whole backstory there. But you find that these women were using mentalism, and it wasn't always through writing. It could also be through other creative arts, or paintings, or the psychic arts, holding seances, making money. The Fox sisters were these famous charlatans who went around for 20 or 30 years saying that they heard, rappings, and that was from the spirit. And they faked it the whole time, and admitted later to faking it. But they made quite a bit of money. And then a couple of them drank it all away. So that's a great story in and of itself. There's a lot of these like kind of amazing stories, but these women just didn't really have, I'm not giving them, extra sympathy or anything, but you have to look at it in the lens of what was going on at the time and how could you break free from that. And the woman who was successful writing as Patience Worth was friends with the woman who wrote the Mark Twain novel. And they actually used to go to seances together. So there's a lot of these like crazy stories that kind of intersect and cross. And so it just kind of makes you think about, the difference between the divine spark and the muse. So Mark Twain, there's evidence of this kind of correspondence between the two of them in which he almost condescendingly says, well, just keep writing. But she comes across as a little desperate to get his attention and get his help. So a bit of a fangirl there. And you just kind of have these stories where, this woman who tried to find success, perhaps she didn't believe enough in her own abilities, or she had tried so hard to become a successful journalist and a successful writer on her own, that she sort of used this paranormal tool to elevate her status in society. I mean, was it all a grand publicity stunt? Very well may have been. Unfortunately, it was pulled from the stands, so we're not able to know what level of success she would have had with it. But she did have, some. I mean, she goes down in history. She's obscure history, but it's history nonetheless. I want to say that this Twain incident. So the novel is called Jap Heron. And to be honest, I won't even try and tell you what it's about because it's very confusing.
oh
And
really?
and that's sort of, to me, that was the signature that it wasn't Twain, is because I just couldn't really see the point of it. And he's not, I think I said
Okay,
he's
this is
not
the
my.
creative writer in me. I'm like, oh, well, it is being written from the afterlife. I wonder how much.
Well, I mean, so and what a great angle, and what a great hook to say, I have channeled this, whether it's her writing it or she legitimately, I do believe she had these sessions and she had these seances. And I mean, there's this wonderful part in the introduction, and I've put it in my book because it's probably one of my favorite things. Now, as a writer, and I'm sure you'll appreciate this, I have a great fetish for typewriters.
Yes,
And
I need to edit. I can't spell for shit.
well, if you or if you were forced to correspond only on a typewriter, you probably would improve through a correspondence course of some kind, especially the turn of the century. So, and then if you've seen it, if you're familiar with a Ouija board, of course it has numbers and letters all
Mhm.
over it, and things are spelled out. So there's this excellent part in the beginning. I mean, the novel Jap Harone, you could put it in the trash, in my opinion. But what you want is her introduction, in which she talks about the experience of writing. That is its own amazing novel and story. She says that Twain gets frustrated because the quote is something like, he keeps running at the board and he keeps hitting the apostrophes where he wants the commas. And so they actually take and fashion this Ouija board to have more character marks and to have more common, you know, the apostrophe mark gets put on there. I think, I can't remember if there's already a question mark on there. There's several sort of like additions that they make to the Ouija board so that they can channel it faster, so that the ghost of Twain can dictate his thoughts faster. So it's
This is
just,
fascinating. Have you
oh,
ever
it's
read
amazing.
What Dreams May Come?
No,
You see the movie with Robin Williams by chance?
I have not.
No. Oh, well, the guy who wrote, oh man, I'm really horrible with names to begin with, but the guy who wrote the book, he's really a fantastic science fiction fantasy writer. And basically what he does is have his character go to an afterlife and then decide he wants to dictate his story to his brother on Earth. And he misses the boat on this whole idea of how he dictates the story to his brother on Earth, who basically, writes this big 300-page novel somehow, I guess, to a Ouija board or some sort. And the idea of a corporeal being, is that the right term? Dictating a whole novel. Are you still there?
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm
Okay.
listening. Yeah, yeah.
It's
Oh
so
yeah.
frustrating
Well,
when you don't
the
know.
the idea of I mean, what is really the difference between saying it's a ghost or saying it's your muse, or the thing that happens when you compose a song, or the thing that happens when you're on stage and you're a great actor and you sort of transform, and there's something divine that happens, and you as the artist are just the conduit. In this case, there were many Victorian women who used the spiritual medium as their template, and they were the conduits, whether they were channeling different entities and charging people to come to seances, or they were writing novels or poetry, award-winning poetry, as is the case with Patience Worth. Or one woman who was from New York, and she was actually jailed for distributing lewd material. She distributed material during a time in which women were not only were you not allowed to have marital, any kind of relations, you were basically considered a prostitute if you had any semblance of sexual activity prior to marriage. But not only that, when you were married, nobody told you what to expect. So you went into your wedding night like kind of terrified. So this woman just simply published some material that explained what to
Oh,
expect. Wash
yeah.
yourself in a certain way. This may hurt, but and it was all very like Victorian. Do your husbandly, do your duty to your husband or whatever. But she was considered to be distributing lewd materials, and she was persecuted by Anthony Comstock, who was the head of the Suppression for Moral Vice, and ended up persecuting her to the point that she was arrested, threatened with life as an institution, and she took her own life. She actually
Wow.
claimed that her materials came from an angelic being. And in fact,
Her
the
persecutions?
her all of her so the things that she wrote, her
Oh, okay.
experiences that she wrote about, the knowledge she claimed, this is a whole, I mean, there's books on this lady. Her name was Ida Craddock, and there's some speculation that she had multiple lovers, and there's others who say no, she claimed that she got all of her knowledge of the marriage bed from an angel that she had sex with, who came in through her window. And that's not why she was persecuted, however. She was persecuted for the distribution of lewd material, which was informing women of some of the basics of, sex. And
I
yeah,
got
so
distracted while you were telling me that, thinking about not
about
only
sex,
are
yeah.
there, no, obviously I could get distracted by the idea of sex, but no, I got distracted by the idea there are places on this earth where that still happens, and then the idea that in this
Yeah.
country there are people in power that would love for us to get back to that place where we could get persecuted for being in control of our own
Oh
bodies.
yeah, baby, Handmaid's Tale all over again, right?
I hadn't seen it or read the book, unfortunately. I've heard it's pretty
Well,
good though.
that's essentially, there are certain women who are kept as handmaids in order to have sex with the husbands of the wives of another class. I mean, that's basically the all rights are stripped, and you are essentially not a machine, but it is a very science fictiony kind of approach to it.
What a
But
world.
yeah, I mean, I think I guess I just digress down this like paranormal path because it does bring to question the idea of that spark. And is that spark your ghost? Is that spark your muse? Do you own that spark completely yourself, or is it really out of your control? And most writers would tell you it's kind of out of control. There's things you can do, right? There's rituals you can do. There's things you can do to get yourself in a creative mode.
2 o'clock in the
But,
morning. That's what I do.
right? I
That's
mean,
how I
it's
get my juices flowing.
they say actually between 2 and 5 you can get some of the best creative energy. But I've
Interesting.
also read things like you have to actually write for 45 minutes to an hour before you can hit that sort of creative stride. And so that's why they tell you to just sit down and write anything and don't think about it, and just write crap if you have to, because you have to get to that divine spark.
Interesting.
And
There was
yeah.
one point that I wanted to make about the Samuel Clemens story. The detail of the comma versus the apostrophe. That to me speaks of something. Why would she bring that to, I mean, that just makes me think there's something more to her story than just, oh, Samuel Clemens told me this novel that I had to write down. You know what I mean? I
Well,
mean,
yeah, well, and those are the times when she quotes Twain's ghost and what he's telling her to do. I hope there's no other ladies in the room. I know you can handle this language, and he'll say something that would have been considered a little bit maybe crass at the time, or these things, when she quotes him, it sounds so much like something he would say, only the ghost version of him. And just this idea of the kind of relationship, whether it was real or imagined, that she had with him. I mean, maybe they were secret lovers. I don't know. No
yeah,
evidence has come out about that. There was some correspondence between them. There was a second or third degree of separation. And I believe it was during the sort of San Francisco era. But, there's as I said, I mean, I think you could really write an entire book just on this, and I could do a great deal more research on being able to, you can read a couple of the letters in there's some archives I think at UC Berkeley, but there's a lot more to the story. And I think just the fact that she she was trying to support the idea that they actually were dictating this whole novel. That's why I think she got into the grammar and the punctuation. And, she was a writer and editor. And to kind of just the idea of this, the idea of this Ouija board becoming essentially the typewriter. I
yeah,
mean, what an incredible image that is,
yeah,
with the funny little ghost of Twain running at the board trying to get the planchet to move where he wants it to.
right. I mean,
But
it's alphabetical order though, isn't it? It's not in like the QWERTY style of a keyboard.
the Ouija board, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, but exactly, but there's, it's limited, and certainly at that time it had even, there were some even more simple kind of versions of it. So it may not have even had, like, I mean, it usually just had yes, no, and like the, numbers 1 through 0, and then the A to Z. But they
You
they
have said
basically.
amazing things in the last hour that we talked, but I love Mark Twain. That dude has been in my life forever. Like one of the first things I read were, little children's versions of Tom Sawyer
Of
and Huckleberry
course.
Finn, right?
Yes. Yes,
And
absolutely.
there was a claymation version of something he wrote, or maybe not even, where he hopped the ride on Halley's Comet when I was in like, you remember
Oh,
that? I don't know what it
that
was called. But anyway,
I
Samuel Clemens,
that's
Mark
funny. I
Twain
do remember that. I have like a childhood memory of that.
was amazing. I watched it over and over again as a kid. It was just really a magical experience for me. But the idea that as a writer, one of my worst fears is leaving something behind unfinished, something, that I really was desperately waiting to complete. And obviously Clemens, I don't know how he died. He died in New York up here on 14th Street. His house is no longer in existence. It got torn down and something horrible was built in its place. And I probably walked by it a million times. It's probably like, who knows, something horrible, some McDonald's or whatnot. But anyway, the idea that he wanted desperately to tell this one final story, and this woman who probably didn't get the education that she wanted to get, who wanted desperately to tell a story that was stuck in her soul, and he came back from the afterlife to help her tell a story, but wasn't her story. Couldn't get it
But yet it
unlocked for
but yet it
heart.
was her story. And yet the sort of the whole, I mean, if you think about that just as a literary tool, I mean, we're obsessed with the afterlife and the idea that, well, Prince isn't really dead, or Elvis isn't really dead. And, we don't quite fully accept when these iconic people die. And so, some people might market that or try and ride the curtails of that. But she had a very creative approach to that. And her kind of the whole premise of that as a literary device, I mean, the paranormal as a literary device, that is kind of an incredible topic, and I touch on it in my book. There's a chapter on it, but there's so much more to it, and as you said, like, you can look at it from so many different points of view,
Yeah,
as a
I like
writer,
it.
as a woman, as a
A
as a
skeptic.
fan,
Is
as
that
a
everything?
skeptic. Yeah, it's got it all. It's
It's got
great
it all.
American story. Yeah.
Have you written a standalone book before, or have they always kind of been episodic, kind of chaptery? This is this chapter, next chapter. I don't know what you would call it.
Yeah.
Have you written
Yeah.
like a standalone
No, all of my books are kind of collections, but I do
collection?
have several fiction things in the works, several short stories that are completed, but I have a couple of other horror projects that I'm kind of working on the side, but I don't think my publisher will. I mean, the publisher that I work with does not publish that kind of writing. So, if I want to continue writing about paranormal and occult and things of that nature, I'm sure, convince my publisher to gamble on me a little longer. But as far as fiction goes, that's a brave new world for me.
Are you? Did I see on your website you put your fiction on there? Don't you? Or am I
Um,
wrong?
oh, what you saw was actually the winner of a contest that I ran, and I like to run these contests from time to time because one, it's very humbling because there's so many people out there that are such great writers, and it's just a good reminder that there are plenty of good writers that are not published, and that it's just fun. It's fun to connect with fans of the books and of the topics. So this one was to kick off my fairy tale, my book about fairies, pukas, and changelings. I did like an introductory paragraph to a fairy tale and asked people to submit their completed work, the completed story under a certain number of words, mostly to save myself from having to read. And I got actually hundreds of submissions, and worked it down to like three. And the winner was actually this wonderful, hilarious poem that this guy wrote. And so I published those on the site, and those are just the winners of the contest. At this time, I have a couple of new ventures. I'm going to be starting a podcast that is Tales of the Strange, and so that will
Oh,
have,
awesome.
yeah, so that'll have everything from like the topics we've talked about. Some of it will be my research, some of it will be interviewing people, and we hope to be able to bring it out where we're going on site to places and interviewing people and getting their stories about experiences and things like that. So that there's some bonus material that'll be tied in with that. And yeah, I mean, there's, but no, to date, I've not written a book that starts with a beginning and ends with an with an end.
Well, I think that would make a great story, the relationship between this woman and a dead Samuel Clemens. I want to read it very badly. I also want to write it very badly. So hurry up, put pen to
Oh, right.
paper. I have like
No,
6
it's
novels in the works right now, and I can't put pen to paper on any of the other ones until I finish the one I'm currently working on. So you have tons of time.
Oh yeah, great. Well, until you get this out there in the public. Now, it's a wonderful idea, and actually, if you think about it, the Lovely Bones did something along those lines. I mean, that's another example of a story that was told from the point of view of a ghost talking
Yeah.
to her mom, I guess. So, yeah, there's much to it, but yeah, the relationship between a woman and the ghost of a famous literary figure is definitely fascinating. And would
The
make a
way
great
the
story.
way you talk about her though is so intimate. You kind of, I mean, the world kind of needs to understand that time era too, the struggles, especially now.
Yeah.
The narrative is very similar, and the way women are treated, kind
Oh
of
yeah.
dismissed.
Yeah, dismissed. Absolutely. And she was dismissed. And I'm not saying she wasn't a charlatan. I mean, she very well may have been, but she did have something. And, whatever she did, she did it out of desperation to be published and to make a name for herself that wasn't just her husband's name,
Yeah,
which was very, very common to, you got hired as a writer at a paper because your husband was there or your father-in-law owned the paper or things like that. Then they would give you a chance and they would usually make you write an advice column. So, which personally I would love to write an advice column because I think it could do well.
I mean, you look at it like this though. I mean, there's a niche, and she found it, and she wedged
Yeah.
herself in there. I mean,
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
not? People do it all the time. Stephanie Myers did it, vampires or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, their own certain kind of vampire too. She took the kind of iconic and she tweaked it just enough to make it different, and found great success with that.
But the religious uh, kind of overtones of vampires. That was my first episode of Mirage Vampires,
Oh,
and we never really
yeah.
got to it.
Yeah, just not enough time to talk
Yep.
about vampires. I mean, vampires are their own great thing. There's I apologize that you have not received the books because you really should have received them probably months ago. But in my Banshees, Werewolves, and Vampires, on the topic of vampires and religion, one of the first vampire stories ever published was published in French and translated to English later, is about a priest and his relationship with a beautiful woman who is a vampire. And it is very racy. It is very, for the time especially, it's got a little necrophilia, it's got, immortality, it's got a little bit of everything in there. And it's a great short story. It's called Clarimond. So I will make sure you get a copy of that. But if you get a chance to read one story out of there, read that story.
And being that we've had this conversation for a little over an hour, if there's anything in here that you remember that you could send me links to, so I can fill out the notes, so that people can also kind of explore elements of the conversation as well. No problem at all. Please do so. Unfortunately, I've rotted my brain with.
Oh, I've got links up the wazoo, and I write about a lot of this stuff on my website as well
Okay.
from time to time as these thoughts come up. But I certainly do. I have, I can send links to all my books. I can send links to some of the other works that I was talking about, and to some of the Gutenberg is like a great resource to find some of
The
this stuff.
Gutenberg,
But
yeah, that website, the royalty-free, not royalty-free, that's a wrong term.
it's public domain.
Public domain, yeah, thank
And
you.
that doesn't necessarily mean you can do whatever you want with it, but it does
You're not
mean
buying
that the rights have expired, and therefore it is in the public. Like the public has the right to read it, share it, distribute it. You know, you can excerpt from it, you can put it in collections, and you can read it. You can download it in like ebooks directly to your whatever e-reader, if you use those machine device things for reading.
Are you a paper book reader,
I'm
or
a paper book reader.
are you?
Yes, I
I
am.
have not read a paper book in almost 5 years now. I'm
Wow.
completely on my phone. I don't know
Well,
if
I think
that's
for
like
me,
running my
because
brain.
so much of my, you know, my day job, my income comes from being on the computer and writing in that way, because that's the way that you publish now, and that's how you promote yourself. That when I read, it's my escape and it's my sanctuary. And if I'm reading on something that I'm going to get a text message on, I can't, you know, or if I'm reading something that will hyperlink me to a website. Now I know that that's a wonderful thing, or will hyperlink me to a definition, but I like to just have to figure it out and fall asleep with the book, you know, on my face. It's just like it's a personal thing, you know, to each his own.
I just like having finished a book and then knowing that I have 50 or 60 or 150 books waiting for me to pick up. That's just the best feeling. Or getting bored with the
Yeah,
book that I'm
they also
reading and
call those
having,
libraries.
yes, but I have it in my hand. I have it right there. I love it. I just love it so much. The modern
No,
world that
I think it's wonderful. And it's also, I do like those devices, especially for like,
throwing at
I
your
don't,
cat.
yeah, I like them for the people that like them and that get a lot out of you know, are able to read like that. You know, my mother-in-law, for example, can carry it around and, you know, has it like endlessly and has hundreds of books on there, and she can adjust the font size and all of that stuff. I'm not saying they're just for old people. I'm just saying you will find, though, like I definitely do find some publishers, in order to get enough stuff in the book, will use the smallest typeface, and it is just painful to read. I mean, you
Mhm.
find yourself thinking, maybe I should have a magnifying glass. I know I'm getting old, but this is ridiculous. So
Yeah.
you know, if it's not 12-point font, it's pretty hard to, you know, be able to read it in the moonlight for sure.
Yeah, exactly. That room is dark and my wife is sleeping. I've got the phone. That's my favorite part. You don't have to worry about
Oh,
light
that's a good point. Yeah, you don't have to
everywhere.
have the book light.
Hmm.
Well, you haven't sold me, but I appreciate that you appreciate.
I do. I will tell you this. I miss the smell of a library, and I do miss the smell of a book.
But it's still there.
Yeah, I know, but I have to actually go to the
The smell.
library.
I do smell books. That's funny you said that. I smell books when I get a new book, or when I'm in a bookstore. If I'm gonna buy a book, I do sniff it. That's book sniffing. It's a thing.
And there's no better feeling than having actually crossed that median of a book and having, knowing how much is left. I'm all about percentages now. Oh, I've read 20% of the book. Oh, I've read 30% of the book. Looking at a page number going, oh, okay, now I've got 500 pages left or something like that. It's a different world.
Yeah, oh, because the device tells you what percentage you've
Yeah,
read.
exactly.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I've got 20 pages left. No,
The
you're
electronic device.
95%.
Uh-huh. Oh, okay. Because I have a bookmark, so I just I just
So
use that.
this,
But
again, like I said, this has been very enjoyable. I'm so happy that I begged you to be
thank
on
you
the
so much.
podcast.
A very different kind of interview for me, and really a lot of fun. So I appreciate it. And
So I finish up with some questions. I want to ask, what are you reading right now?
what am I reading right now? Let's see. I just finished a novel by, let's see, her name is Tana French, and she is an Irish crime writer. So I just finished The Trespasser by Tana French. And I also just scored two really exciting books from my local little free library. They're two books. One's called The Curse of the Green Ghost, and I forget what the other one's called, but they're old 60s kind of middle grade readers, published in the 1960s, part of the Alfred Hitchcock Presents library. And so they're very kind of that, like, Scooby-Doo kind of ghost era. I guess a little earlier than Scooby-Doo, but that kind of like 60s teen ghost publication. So I just got those, and I just started reading the Curse of the Green Ghost. So those are my Those are on
That's
my
so
books
cool.
right
There are so many publications that will just disappear and nobody will ever read them. You know what I mean? In terms of like just that nobody will ever get their hands on.
Yeah, and then you just happen upon them like that. Oh, and then the other novel I also just finished was Into the Water by Paula Hawkins, and she's the woman who wrote Girl on the Train. If you didn't read that, it's a wonderful book. And Into the Water is much witchier, actually. It's got some witchy elements to it, along with the sad and horrifying true crime kind of aspect of it. So
You have been asked for a piece of advice. What do you say?
I guess it depends on what the advice is. I mean, is it marriage advice or writing advice or
I don't know. What kind of advice do you want to give? Life.
life advice? I guess I would say, regardless of what you think or how you think you're doing, keep writing, because every writer has thousands and thousands of words on the cutting room floor. Published writers. Bram Stoker, after he died, left behind an entire collection of works he deemed unpublishable. His widow published them, and some of those short stories are to this day the most terrifying short stories and beautiful short stories I've ever read. And to him, they were crap.
That's so amazing.
So your crap just might be, it's what you need. You've got to write the crap to get to the good stuff.
That's amazing. Yeah, I didn't even know anything other than Dracula.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
thinking about Salinger while you were talking about that, because I only know of Catcher in the Rye. He was the same way, wasn't he? Just published that one.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, he had such tremendous success with Dracula that he probably didn't really need to publish more. But this collection of short stories is there's one that's set in Paris, and it's about these rats that are kind of following this man around. I mean, it's very kind of short Stephen King like. Actually, it's incredible. And then I guess my last parting word would be, you never know what's creeping out there in the night. So, lock your doors.
No, definitely lock your doors. Where can we find you? Yeah, definitely lock your
Oh,
doors.
yeah. I'm not going to give out my address after that. No, no, you can find me on my website. It's varlaventura.net. And that's just my name.net. And I keep everyone up to date on, whatever's going on there. Or you can find me on Facebook. Same thing, Facebook/Varla Ventura.
Best name ever, Varla Ventura, Ventura.
That's right.
Fantastic talking with you. Really,
Thank
really,
you.
really enjoyed it.
Thank you so
And
much.
yeah, you have a great day and stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. It was really fun.
Yeah, it was. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
good. Take care.
And that was Varla Ventura. I have a slate of content creators coming up. Mirage is being developed. 2 episodes so far. Stephen King and Charlene Harris are definitely in the can. The episode on Kurt Vonnegut is still kicking around the old noggin. I am slightly intimidated to actually make it work. So, hopefully that'll happen sooner than later so that I can stop thinking about it and actually make it happen. Bry Aiello, BRYAIELLO, is how you can follow me on Twitter. That is the #1 place to find updates on not only my podcast, but also my fiction when I post stuff on brianaiello.com, which is the home for basically everything that I put on the internet. What else I gotta tell you? I mean, that's pretty much it. me@brianaiello.com is the #1 email address for questions and comments. Follow, like, comment, subscribe, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, all that good stuff. Really appreciate you listening. It makes me feel good. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.